All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Center for Marxist Education. Today, we're hosting widely acclaimed speaker, writer, journalist, and political analyst, Caleb Maupin. He has traveled extensively in the Middle East and in Latin America. He was involved with the Occupy Wall Street movement from its early planning stages and has been involved in many struggles for social justice. He's an outspoken advocate of international friendship and cooperation, as well as 21st century socialism. Today, he's going to be discussing the role Kamala Harris plays in the future of the American ruling class. And for those interested, I will send a link in the chat for you to buy his new book on Kamala Harris and the future of America. And you can get started now. I will mute everyone.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to give a presentation remotely via Zoom to the Center for Marxist Education. I have had the honor of visiting your in-person facility a few years ago to give a presentation, and it's a beautiful facility, and it's very, very important. It's important to have spaces like the Center for Marxist Education where people can engage with a very, very important ideology, the ideology that raised millions and millions of people out of poverty in the 20th century, the ideology that defeated the Nazis during the Second World War, the ideology that invented space travel, the ideology that gave a boost to the civil rights movement, the ideology that built the labor movement. The role of Marxism in the history of humanity is so widely underappreciated. I will never forget, I was watching The Daily Show with Jon Stewart years ago, and they had J.K. Rowling, the author of Harry Potter. She was being interviewed by Jon Stewart, and they were talking about how one of her books took place in what was called a red area in Britain. And she says, red means left-wing or liberal. And Jon Stewart says, that's weird. In the United States, red is conservative, but in Britain, red is left-wing or liberal. I wonder why that is. And they both just sat there with this perplexed look on their faces. Why is the left associated with red? And they just had this perplexed look on their faces. And I was ready to like scream at my television. I was so furious to see that knowledge of socialism and Marxism and the class struggle and historical and dialectical materialism had been so widely eroded. So what the Center for Marxist Education is doing by maintaining a space where people can become educated about Marxism and socialism and about the very, very, very important ideology and understanding and really the important science that is so key in building up human struggles for justice. I think it's very, very, very good that such a space can exist, that it can exist in Boston. It can exist in proximity to Harvard University, where people from all over the world go and study. It's very, very important. So I want to commend you for everything you've done to keep the Center for Marxist Education intact, even amid these hard times, amid this pandemic, amid this time when there's so much confusion. So I set out to write a book about Kamala Harris. And the reason I wrote a book about Kamala Harris was because I was tipped off by someone who was a rather important scholar and academic associated with Marxism about Kamala Harris's father. Kamala Harris's father is Donald Harris, and he is a Marxian economist. He taught at Stanford University for many years. He was an advisor to the government of Michael Manley, the social democratic leader of Jamaica. And that perplexed me. And the more I investigated Kamala Harris, the more I realized there was a story here. And it said something very much not just about an individual who is likely to be the president of the United States very soon. She's going to be sworn in as vice president on January 20th. But there's a story here about our political movement, and there's a story here about some of the confusion that has emerged in the Marxist movement, especially during what you can call the late Cold War. So I wanted to point out by saying that in understanding Kamala Harris, it's really important that we deconstruct the myth of the American criminal justice system, because part of what holds US society together, or held US society together for a long time, is the mythology that America and the United States has this amazing criminal justice system where, people only go to prison if they are convicted by a jury of their peers, and everyone is given a fair trial, and you're only, the jury will only convict you unless there is not a shadow of a doubt that you are innocent, etc. And that that criminals get away on technicalities all the time, and are this is a mythology that's developed, and television and police television shows are very very essential in promoting this mythology. But anyone who has dealt with the criminal justice system, and anyone who has worked with victims of police brutality, anyone who has worked with prisoners or done counseling work will tell you what a myth this is. This is not the reality of the criminal justice system in the United States. The overwhelming majority of cases in the United States never go to trial. Very rarely is there a trial in the United States. Generally, when someone's accused of a crime, they plea bargain. And in the rare instance that a case does go to trial, something's not right. If a case does go to trial in the American criminal justice system, something's not right. It could be that this is the person's third strike, and they're facing a very harsh penalty. In California, they had the 3-strike law. It was an automatic 25-year sentence for your third felony. It could be the person's very, very, very wealthy and can afford such a good defense, they think they can be acquitted. But for the most part, if someone risks going to trial because of the trial penalty in the United States, the sentences are much harsher if you get a trial. If someone risks going to trial, the chances are they're probably innocent of the crime, because the risk of going to trial and actually having a trial where a prosecutor is forced to prosecute you and a judge and a jury are selected, the risk of the trial penalty is so extreme that very rarely do people ever go to trial. But yet, even though very rarely do people ever go to trial, and if they do go to trial, there's a very good chance they're probably innocent of what they've done, because why in the world would they take the huge risk of having a trial? Something's not right if they do indeed go to trial. The conviction rate in state and federal courts is very high. I mean, it's like 90-95%. So even though people rarely risk going to trial, the conviction rate is very, very high. And juries are overwhelmingly, predisposed to convict people. The Bronx, which is, one of the poorest counties in the entire country, in New York City, the Bronx borough of New York City has one of the lowest conviction rates in the country, and their conviction rate is 66%. So, two-thirds of the people who go on trial in the Bronx are convicted, but that's considered one of the lowest conviction rates in the country. And that shows how rigged the legal system is against working people who are on trial. And the criminal justice system is very much, set up to target people who are vulnerable, to target people who maybe are inarticulate and wouldn't be able to defend themselves and be articulate on the stand. Maybe they have difficulty speaking English, people who can't afford a good defense. It's set up to target people on the basis of their race or ethnicity and play into the prejudices of jurors. There's been a lot of revelations about this. And one of the great things about the Black Lives Matter uprising has been deconstructing the whole mythology we have around the American criminal justice system. So if you understand what the American criminal justice system is, and you understand what Michelle Alexander and so many others have written about mass incarceration and prisons for profits and all of these horrendous things, then if you look at the career of the woman who is about to become vice president of the United States, it's deeply, deeply disturbing. Kamala Harris, if you look at her record, she's very much the queen of mass incarceration. She became a prosecutor in California, in the San Francisco Bay Area. And at the time that California's prison population was rapidly increasing, Kamala Harris's career as a criminal prosecutor was also taking off. And it's been revealed that the Attorney General's office of California, when she was California Attorney General, was frequently being castigated by the courts for breaking the law, concealing evidence to try and convict people. There were drug labs that were bringing false results, and this information was not given to defendants. There were situations where the Attorney General's office of California was trying to keep people in prison, to use them as cheap labor. And I mean, she just, presided over an Attorney General's office that was engaging in all kind of misconduct to maximize the rate of incarceration, to lock people in jail. And there's one particularly horrendous case, the case of Kevin Cooper. Now, Kevin Cooper was facing execution. He was scheduled to be executed, and the governor of California He wanted there to be some DNA evidence acquired to make sure that Kevin Cooper was actually guilty of the crime. And Kamala Harris and her attorney general's office tried to block the acquiring of DNA evidence. Well, they were overruled. DNA evidence showed that Kevin Cooper was not guilty of the crime, and Kevin Cooper's execution was stopped. But Kamala Harris was prepared to block DNA evidence and prevent the and basically go ahead with the execution of an innocent man, and try to block DNA evidence that would have acquitted him. I mean, these are situations that are very disturbing, and you have to wonder what kind of person could do such a thing. Well, if you investigate Kamala Harris, her actions might make sense if she had come from what people like to refer to as the thin blue line milieu, right? Police, prosecutors, their families. There is a kind of culture that might lead one to think that way, right? If you ever talk to people who have a police officer in their family, or people that are involved in the prosecutorial wing of the criminal justice system, I've often said it's almost like they're in a cult. I mean, they believe that the criminals, that all the prisons are full of PlayStations and TVs, and criminals are being coddled, and innocent and guilty criminals get away all the time. And Alan Dershowitz and some of the most well-known legal scholars have talked about the fact that police get up and give false testimony, and police perjury is a reality of the U.S. criminal justice system. And so, it would make sense if Kamala Harris had grown up in a family where both of her parents were police officers or prosecutors. She believed police officers were victims, that police brutality was a myth invented by communist agitators to hurt our American way of life, blah, blah, blah. If she grew up in the thin blue line milieu, it would make sense what Kamala Harris did when she was the prosecutor and the attorney general in California. However, that's not what happened. Kamala Harris, as I pointed out before, her father was a Marxian economist and is a Marxian economist. He's retired now. He lives in Jamaica. Her mother was an immigrant and a cancer researcher from India. And they met at civil rights marches and protests in Berkeley, at University of California, Berkeley, in the early 1960s. And Kamala Harris, in her autobiography, The Truths We Hold, she describes how she spent her childhood going to demonstrations and marches against racism and police brutality. And so this all raises the question of, how does the Marxist movement, how does the progressive movement in the United States produce someone who very well knows about the history of racism in the United States, very well knows about the ugly realities of what goes on, but seems to not really care what is going on there? And that is the question that in my book, I dig into. And that's why I wrote this book, because it requires us to kind of examine the socialist and Marxist movement, examine the US ruling class and the divisions within the US ruling class and the trajectory of American politics, and figure out what is going on. Now, one thing that's important to note is that the political upsurge of the 1960s was the result of a division in the ruling class of the United States. And I talk about the trajectory of American politics since the Second World War. That after the Second World War, there was McCarthyism. And there was a huge clampdown on socialists and communists. The Communist Party's national board was sent to federal prison. Communists were unable to get jobs. The House Un-American Activities Committee went after Hollywood. And there was this extreme anti-communist clampdown in US society. And after the execution of the Rosenbergs, and after Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956, McCarthyism started to defrost, or to edge, right? It was kind of bogging down. And the reason for that was that there was a feeling that the people who came after Stalin in the Soviet Union, Khrushchev might be somebody the United States could negotiate with. There was also a feeling that McCarthyism had gotten so out of control that figures in the ruling class were being targeted. Let's not forget, Joe McCarthy accused the U.S. Army of being communist, right? Joe McCarthy actually went after a U.S. senator and blackmailed him and got him to commit suicide out of a fear of revelations about his son's involvement in politics and such. And that McCarthyism kind of became a vehicle for one section of the ruling class to very viciously go after other sections of the ruling class. And that, resulted in a big pushback against McCarthyism, not among the working class, but among the ruling class. There was a feeling that McCarthyism was dangerous demagogy that had gotten so out of control. And in the aftermath of McCarthyism, you had you had the rise of, the Cold War liberals. You had the Kennedy administration. And part of that was a covert CIA program that is well documented now. It's a matter of public record. It was covert and secret at the time, called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And this was a covert CIA program to funnel money to left-wing academics, left-wing artists, left-wing musicians, left-wing scholars. And the idea was to divert left-wing and socialist movements away from the Soviet Union and away from Marxism-Leninism, and to create kind of a barrier intellectually between, left-wing voices and left-wing artists and the left-wing intelligentsia and the Soviet Union, as well as the broad masses of people. And the Congress for Cultural Freedom program was very successful. And some of the primary voices of left-wing ideology, or what calls itself left-wing ideology in the United States, can trace their careers back to this covert CIA program of funding left-wing voices. The Congress for Cultural Freedom, it funded Partisan Review magazine. And it's Partisan Review magazine that brought us Susan Sontag and Hannah Arendt. And there were many Trotskyites, followers of Max Shachtman, who was a Trotskyite who broke with Leon Trotsky, said the Soviet Union was not a workers' state. Followers of Max Shachtman were heavily involved in this program, the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And the director of the Congress for Cultural Freedom program was Irving Kristol. Irving Kristol had been a Trotskyite, but he directed the CIA program, and eventually he became the father of neoconservatism, Irving Kristol. And his son, Bill Kristol, is the editor of the Weekly Standard, the conservative publication, the neocon publication. So the CIA was covertly funding leftists to create a barrier between them and the Soviet Union. And in the process, they were also kind of reinventing leftism and Marxism. And, you talk about the Frankfurt School, Theodor Adorno, and other voices. Herbert Marcuse were covertly supported. Their writings were published in the publication of the CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom program in Germany called Der Monat, and that was how they were subsidized and promoted. In the Frankfurt School, it argued that it was intellectuals, not the working class, who would make the revolution. It had a strong critique of the Soviet Union. There are some things that were written that almost kind of equated the Soviet Union and Marxism-Leninism with fascism, as both of them being authoritarian schools of thought. And that as part of this program to covertly fund left-wing politics, there was an effort to kind of change what it meant to be a leftist. Leftism no longer meant believing in an ideology and struggling against imperialism and building a mass movement of the working class to seize control of the means of production. Being a leftist suddenly meant that you were deconstructing ideology. You were saying that there is no truth and that ideology is itself totalitarian, and you're fighting for the freedom of the individual against the danger of populism and mass movements in which the inferior rabble are mobilized to threaten the sanctity and the independence of the intellectual. And with Susan Sontag, this is very, very explicitly stated. Susan Sontag very famously stated at a rally supporting the Solidarity movement in Poland, she stated that communism is nothing but the most successful form of fascism. Now, what does that even mean? But according to Susan Sontag, communism, right, a movement that seeks to mobilize the working class to seize control of the means of production, is a dangerous totalitarian movement that is the equivalent of Hitler and the Nazis, because it seeks to mobilize a mass movement of people, and it threatens the liberal protections of intellectuals. It mobilizes these dangerous conforming rabble who don't understand how great and free intellectuals are. This is the kind of thinking that came to kind of dominate a lot of left-wing thought as a result of covert CIA manipulation of leftist politics. And if you look at Kamala Harris's career, the place that she started as a child, she talked about going to a Black cultural center in Oakland, California, called Rainbow Sign, that was started by friends and associates of James Baldwin. And she talks about how that was very influential on her political development. And James Baldwin was also an individual who was covertly supported by American intelligence. The CIA saw that among the Black community, voices like William L. Patterson and Paul Robeson, eventually the Black Panther Party, had a lot of support as they were pushing a Marxist-Leninist and anti-imperialist message. So James Baldwin, who was explicitly anti-communist, but was a voice, calling for Black freedom, was covertly supported. And Kamala Harris really grew up not in the Marxist movement per se, but in the New Left. And the New Left was an entity created specifically for the purpose of trying to create an intellectual barrier between Marxism-Leninism and the intellectuals and middle-class elements who might be sympathetic to it in the West. And that's an important thing to understand, especially now that there is so much confusion. We have, right-wing voices like Jordan Peterson who are saying things like, postmodern cultural Marxism is threatening the United States. We have this whole belief on the American right wing that Joe Biden is a communist, that Kamala Harris is a communist. Well, this is not the case, but postmodernism and a lot of the ideas that dominate the left, while they're not Marxism, they are ideas that were intentionally fomented by one section of the ruling class and by American intelligence as a barrier against actual Marxism. So if you get a little bit further into things, in the second section of the book, I talk about Kamala Harris in terms of personality theory. And it's interesting because the president of the United States is probably one of the most important people in the world. Billions of dollars and billions of human lives are in the hands of the president of the United States. And it's interesting if you look at the fact that the last several presidents of the United States have similar personalities. If you look at the life of Bill Clinton and the life of Barack Obama, you can see some key similarities. Now, Bill Clinton never met his father. His biological father died before he was born. He was raised by a single mother. An abusive stepfather came and went, and Bill Clinton was very close to his mother. He learned at a young age that he was very charismatic and good at speaking. He went to an Ivy League school and eventually became governor of Arkansas and president of the United States. Well, Barack Obama, it's a similar story. His father and mother separated. His father moved back to Kenya and left his mother at a very young age. He was raised by a single mother. His mother then married a military leader from Indonesia who was, by all accounts, probably quite physically abusive to her. Barack Obama stayed with his mother as she separated from this Indonesian stepfather. Barack Obama went to an Ivy League school, eventually moved up in American politics, was political in Chicago, became a U.S. senator, and eventually president of the United States. And very similar personalities. And if you look at George W. Bush and Donald Trump, there are some key similarities. Donald Trump and George W. Bush both had very high achieving fathers, right? George W. Bush's father was CIA director and eventually president of the United States. Donald Trump's father was a wealthy real estate owner in New York City. Both of them seemed to have grown up in the shadow of this high achieving father. And were viewed as kind of the screw up failure son. Donald Trump was sent to military school at a young age, considered to be a rebellious teenager. You have George W. Bush, who was viewed as, a party boy and arrested for drinking and involved in cocaine and was kind of viewed as the screw up failure son of the Bush family. Both of them are involved in a number of very, very highfalutin and attention-seeking business ventures. Bush, buys a baseball team at one point. We know about Donald Trump and his obsession with getting his name in the headlines. And both of them, after kind of screwing up and failing in many areas of life, turned to politics as kind of a last resort. And you can see a similarity there. And why is this important? Because these personalities are very important, and the personality of the president of the United States is something it's worth investigating. And if you can understand on the part of the rich and powerful, on the part of certain entities in the United States, if they can understand how to manipulate the president of the United States to do what they want, they can be very successful. And manipulating Barack Obama was very, very key for certain elements in the United States. We know that that the bombing of Libya and the destruction of Libya was something Barack Obama was reluctant to do. He didn't want to do it. And the way that Ben Rhodes and other people in the Obama administration, Samantha Power, Cass Sunstein, convinced Barack Obama to bomb Libya was by telling Barack Obama that Gaddafi was going to go house to house when he went to Benghazi. He said he was going to go house to house in Benghazi. And they told Barack Obama, this means Gaddafi is going to commit genocide. He's going to murder everyone in Benghazi when he retakes the city from the rebels. And if you don't bomb Libya, Barack, you are going to have that genocide, that mass murder on your hands. And Ben Rhodes and Cass Sunstein and Samantha Power and others worked on Barack Obama for several days, convincing him that if he didn't take action, he would be remembered as somebody who was responsible for letting a genocide happen. And they played up this phrase house to house. And finally, Barack Obama relented and, sent cruise missiles to Libya. And it was through manipulating Barack Obama that a section of the US government and US intelligence that wanted to overthrow the Libyan government was able to manipulate Obama and get what they wanted. So understanding the personality of political figures and how to manipulate them and get what you want is something you can bet millions and millions of dollars, and all kinds of research has been poured into by powerful entities. They want someone in office that they can manipulate. And so it's not surprising that we see similar personalities among figures who rise up and become prominent in American politics. And Kamala Harris is particularly unique because, unlike any other politician in US history, she invokes her own childhood way, way more frequently. I mean, you never see anyone invoke their own childhood as much as Kamala Harris does. There are t-shirts with 10-year-old Kamala Harris's face on them. She made a catchphrase, "That little girl was me." And almost every introduction of Kamala Harris or speech intended to market her includes, some reference to the fact that she was a small child, which is very bizarre. I mean, Kamala Harris is well over 50 years old, but yet her childhood and her experiences as a child are frequently invoked in politics. That is not normal, but it seems to fit in with some aspects of Kamala Harris that you can look into. So who is Kamala Harris? Well, her mother was a cancer researcher from India. Her father is a Jamaican economist who taught at Stanford University. There was a pretty ugly divorce, it seems, in which the father lost all custody. Kamala Harris very much idealizes her mother and views her mother as kind of a feminist icon, fighting for the rights of women. She does not speak about her father, and she and her father are estranged from each other. Her father went as far as denouncing her presidential campaign. Kamala Harris's father said that Kamala Harris's campaign was a travesty of identity politics, and he spoke very, very harshly critically of her campaign. He was very offended by the fact that Kamala Harris, in an interview she did with the Breakfast Club, she said that she was asked if she'd ever smoked marijuana, and she said, "Half of my family is from Jamaica. What do you think?" Well, her Jamaican father was very offended by those words and chose to speak up against her. He actually wrote an interesting essay, Reflections of a Jamaican Father, which I quote extensively in the book, which sheds some light on aspects of Kamala Harris's life and upbringing that she kind of glosses over in her autobiography. And so there's a lot of things about Kamala Harris that raise questions. And it seems like on some level, Kamala Harris fits a very similar profile to a number of female politicians in our time. Kamala Harris, feels she was wronged in her childhood. She was raised by a single mother, estranged from her father, and she seems to have entered the world with a drive for some kind of revenge. And it's very similar to the life story of Samantha Power. Samantha Power, who was Barack Obama's UN ambassador, who was key in pushing Barack Obama to intervene in Libya and in Syria. She was born in Ireland. Her father was an alcoholic. Her mother took her to the United States. Her father died of an alcoholism-related illness. You can talk about Amy Klobuchar, similar story. Father was an alcoholic, was very abusive to the mother. The mother separated from the father. Amy Klobuchar also goes on to become a criminal prosecutor. It's quite an interesting profile. And Amy Klobuchar, and Kamala Harris both display this kind of gleeful desire to harm other people. That's kind of, you see in criminal prosecutors, this desire to, enact revenge and punish people. And what's interesting is in the case of Samantha Power, I mean, she didn't become a criminal prosecutor. She became a war propagandist. And if you look at Samantha Power's entire adult life, she's gone around the world building the case for war, generally against countries led by a powerful man, such as, Milosevic in former Yugoslavia, such as, Gaddafi in Libya, such as, Assad in Syria. There's this desire to prosecute and take revenge against powerful men. I mean, many people have pointed out that, you call somebody a warmonger. Well, I mean, Samantha Power is literally a warmonger. A fishmonger sells fish. Kamala Harris, Samantha Power is a war seller. I mean, that's what she's done throughout her entire adult life, and she became Barack Obama's UN ambassador, and she's recently been appointed to the Biden administration. So personality theory is very interesting, but it's also interesting in light of the Marxist movement, because part of what the Frankfurt School and the Congress for Cultural Freedom did was they kind of took the economics out of Marxism and made Marxism more about aesthetics, right? And that Marxism became about lifting restraints on impulses and fomenting unrest. And Marxism was about kind of giving permission to people to be angry. And you see a combination among the Frankfurt School. They make an effort to combine Marxism with Freudianism. And Sigmund Freud's book, Civilization and Its Discontents, he writes all about how civilization is based on getting people to restrain their impulses. We all have sexual impulses. We all have impulses toward aggression, and that civilization is held together by people being taught to restrain their impulses. And generally, the revolutions and unrests that have taken place throughout recent history, according to Sigmund Freud, is really an attempt to renegotiate these restraints, and to try and renegotiate how society tells people to restrain their impulses. And that liberation is largely viewed by kind of the liberal left, and coming out of the French Revolution is largely viewed as giving people more permission to release more of their impulses. And the French Revolution, many people note that, the crowds that, were cheering as people's heads were being cut off, were also very much incited by the writings of the Marquis de Sade, who was, very much a misogynist, a violent character. His name gives us the word sadism. I mean, he was a sexual criminal, a rapist, a molester of women who was put in a mental hospital. But he's considered one of the ideologues of the French Revolution, and that for the Marquis de Sade, liberation meant giving people permission not only to release their sexual impulses, but to unleash their violent impulses, and that to bring down feudalism in France, the bourgeoisie very much gave the peasantry and the permission to unleash their impulses. And the French Revolution was very much an explosion of released impulses. But then it gets more interesting, because the Soviet Union, right? Again, you have the Russian Revolution, an uprising in which, the Tsarist autocracy is brought down. But as the Soviet Union industrialized and built itself up as a socialist society, it started to almost do the opposite. It started to almost give people what Sigmund Freud referred to as these feelings of religiousness, or these feelings of oneness that he's critiquing. And if you read what admirers of Stalin and admirers of the Soviet Union wrote, they almost have a kind of a conservative appeal. Stalin is seen as kind of a fatherly figure, mobilizing the people to build up their country, building a sense of community. And it's a completely almost opposite approach. I'll read to you a passage here that I quote in the book, because it's rather important in understanding why it is that even still today, Stalin is very popular in Russia. And it's important to understand because it doesn't exactly fit into what, leftism in the United States has become. This is from Tatiana Fedorova, who was involved in building the Moscow subways during Stalin's 5-year plans. She says, "Remember, people were illiterate, lived in virtual darkness, wore birch bark shoes. Even now, I think it's like something out of a fairy tale. It was one of the most difficult times to build this country. To build these great construction sites would only be possible through the unity of the people and the love of the people for their idol. And for us, Stalin was an idol. She writes, everyone was trying to do the best for the country, to raise the heights of the motherland. Then there was what we were doing underground with the Moscow Metro. We worked in such a friendly way. It was a good time. There wasn't much to eat. We weren't well dressed. We were simply very happy. Happy because we were making our personal contribution. It was when the first train went by. It was when the noise of the motor of the first train went by in this clean tunnel, which had until then only seen ordinary little carriages. You can't compare that feeling to anything. The construction workers who felt that will feel it forever. No one forced us to do it. We didn't have to do it, but everyone wanted to. It's very hard to explain, but it was a time of enthusiasts. They said communism is the young people of the world, and we were the young people of those years. Each of us tried to build the foundation of structures with great joy. It was like a happy song. I mean, these are the words of a woman describing the kind of enthusiasm and feelings of unity and oneness that the Soviet Union unleashed among the population to build. And what's interesting is if you read the writings of Edgar Snow, when he's describing what Mao achieved in China, if you read the writings of Anna Louise Strong, who was an American journalist, when she witnessed the construction on the Korean Peninsula or in the Soviet Union or in China, that in a way, the Soviet Union and existing socialism in the 20th century, though it came to power in a revolution that was giving people permission to unleash their impulses, socialism was held together by creating almost a religious feeling of oneness and unity of the people. And it almost had a kind of conservative appeal in this way. It wasn't giving people permission to unleash their impulses. It wasn't encouraging people to be destructive. It was rather giving people a sense of community and oneness that motivated them to go out and build a whole new country and to defeat the Nazis, to invent space travel, to wipe out illiteracy, to have huge economic achievements. And this kind of points to why the political compass in the Western world seems to be so confusing because it seems that during the late Cold War, you have figures like Zbigniew Brzezinski and others that realized there was increasingly a gap between Western intellectuals who want to release their impulses and the socialist countries of the world that are almost, selling themselves and promoting themselves in kind of a conservative way. Right? If you look at the government of China or the government of Cuba or the government of Venezuela, they tell their population that what we offer is stability. You won't be unemployed. You will be protected economically. You won't be exposed to the irrationality of capitalism. You will be safe. Whereas the left seems to be, in the West, seems to very much be into the Trotskyite or Guevaran aesthetics that are about going out and unleashing your rage, breaking things, permanent revolution, tear things down. So there's kind of a divide between existing socialism and the mindset of leftists. And it was manipulating that divide that kind of was very successful and key in the United States in winning the Cold War. You look at Afghanistan, for example, the way Osama bin Laden and the Mujahideen were presented to the world as if they were freedom fighters, as if they were fighting against the evil Soviet tanks. They were peasants rising up. And you look at what happened in Eastern Europe, for example, and the situations and the Prague Spring and eventually the toppling of the socialist governments of Eastern Europe with the color revolutions. What was going on was these kind of leftist and liberal aesthetics were being hijacked to deconstruct socialist societies, to bring in neoliberal Western capitalism, right? That the psychology that leftists had historically tapped into since the time of the French Revolution had been hijacked by the imperialists, while the socialist governments had been kind of fomenting a kind of conservatism in order to justify and build socialism. So this is all showing how confusing politics have gotten in our time, but this all gets back to Kamala Harris, because if you look at where Kamala Harris came from, less than 1% of Democratic voters in the primary voted for her, less than 1%, but yet she's very likely to be the president of the United States very soon. And why is that? It's because she was selected at a meeting in the Hamptons in Long Island by the Hillary Clinton faction. The donors who were encouraging Hillary Clinton to run for president once again changed their minds and decided to financially put their backing behind Kamala Harris. And this is well documented. And that the Hillary Clinton donors put their money behind Kamala Harris. And after that happened, then Tulsi Gabbard, used her limited time on the debate stage to expose Kamala Harris's record as a criminal prosecutor. And what was really going on here? Well, the Hillary Clinton State Department very much represents the faction coming out of the Cold War, the Zbigniew-Brzezinski faction of American intelligence, that argues that the way to defeat anti-imperialist states and to overturn socialism is through fomenting color revolutions and using media, and specifically now using social media, to foment color revolutions and unrest. And the Samantha Power faction, the faction of the Hillary Clinton State Department with, you talk about Anne Marie Slaughter and others, they see populism as the greatest danger, and they call for global revolution to create an open international system. And the Hillary Clinton State Department presided over the coup in Honduras that toppled the socialist government and created instability and chaos in that country. Honduras now has one of the highest murder rates in the world. People are fleeing the country, neoliberalism, cutbacks. They oversaw the overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya. Libya had the highest life expectancy on the African continent, under Libya and Islamic socialism under Gaddafi. Now the country is wrecked. There are two rival factions fighting for power. People are drowning in the Mediterranean trying to get out. You have Syria, a civil war that was fomented using these kind of Guevarian aesthetics of a color revolution, a people's uprising against a dictator. And that Hillary Clinton State Department faction that wanted to team up with Silicon Valley. You have Jared Andrew Cohen, who was on the board of Google Alphabet, who kind of acted as the liaison between the Hillary Clinton State Department and Silicon Valley. That faction very much picked Kamala Harris as their person. So Tulsi Gabbard, who is someone tied in with the US military, who is somebody who has called out the results of these color revolutions around the world, used her limited time on the debate stage to take down Kamala Harris. And after that, Kamala Harris was done. After she pointed out on the debate stage that Kamala Harris has a record of locking people in jail for smoking marijuana and then laughing about smoking marijuana herself, trying to keep an innocent man on death row, etc., destroyed Kamala Harris. But regardless, Kamala Harris was selected by Joe Biden as the running mate. And now Kamala Harris will be our vice president, is likely to be the president of the United States very soon. And this faction of the US ruling class, the Silicon Valley faction, that is committed to fomenting kind of unrest and chaos and global revolution by hijacking the left-wing aesthetics and, kind of the Frankfurt School's association of left-wing politics with simply releasing impulses. That faction has selected Kamala Harris to be their voice. And psychologically, this fits in with Kamala Harris's life and trajectory. Kamala Harris feels she was a victim. Kamala Harris very much has a desire to punish and to destroy. And so this all fits into how confusing American politics has gotten. But at the end of the day, it raises the question of, will actual Marxist populism return? Will the politics of Gus Hall and William Z. Foster and Eugene Debs and Huey Newton return? Will Marxism become a movement that is about, organizing the working class and the broad masses of people to fight for their rights against the ultra rich? Or will Marxism remain simply an intellectual movement, simply a movement about alienation, simply a movement about giving people permission to release their impulses and anger? Will the efforts of American intelligence to distort Marxism be successful, or will a genuine populist movement emerge? Donald Trump is not a populist. Donald Trump is a good friend of the rich and powerful. He lifted restrictions on them. He was a friend of the military-industrial complex. He deregulated the market. He cut taxes on the rich. He prolonged and exacerbated the economic crisis. Donald Trump is not a fighter for the working class. But if you look at real populism in the United States, if you look at Roosevelt and his alliance with the Communist Party during the Popular Front period, if you look at Huey Long and the way he took measures in Louisiana to aid working families, there is a history of real working class populism in the United States. It's very closely tied in with socialism and class struggle and Marxism. So the question is, will that class struggle politics be revived? Because there has been a huge amount of confusion and a huge effort to distort Marxism and what the Marxist movement, our movement, stands for. So that is basically what my book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, is all about. I get into it in a lot of depth. And I'll be happy to answer questions about it. And I want to thank you again for maintaining a great space like the Center for Marxist Education and for inviting me to give this presentation.
Okay, so we can open it up to questions now. Just if you have anything to add, unmute yourself and we'll go through this in an orderly way.
Oh,
Go ahead.
I was gonna ask about the relation of the Frankfurt School with the Center for Cultural Freedom, because they both push anti-Marxist-Leninist narratives, right? Is that what Caleb was saying earlier?
Yeah.
So should I
Okay.
answer that? Go ahead.
Well, I have to like specify what exactly it is that I wanted to ask, but so then do you think that there may be some merit to some of the paranoia that is infused with the rhetoric from people like Jordan Peterson, and that he puts so much hyper focus and emphasis on the Frankfurt School, and though he may be misguided, I guess he's pointing out something that has materially produced outcomes that are not desirable within society. Because as you said before, it may have been a conservative take that some Marxist-Leninist states like the USSR and China under Mao may have taken, but at the very least, the outcomes produced were more materially desirable. So then what is purported, or then the proponents of like the Frankfurt School wanted. And you gave an example of the Marquis de Sade, how those desires in action like produce someone very heinous that we should condemn, right, during the French Revolution. So I was saying, like, do you think that there's merit to what some right-wing grifters might have to say about contemporary leftism in the West?
So do I want to answer that, or do we want to take another one, or how do we do this?
Oh.
See, you could go ahead and answer that one and then we'll take another.
Okay. Well, I think the problem gets down to this. US society was held together by certain ideological myths, right? The United States is the greatest country in the world. We're the most free country in the world, blah, blah, blah. No country has ever been as free as this country. You know, we've all heard this our whole lives, right? And this is what kind of held the US together during the Cold War, the American dream. You can work hard, you can get ahead, you can say whatever you want and think whatever you want, but I guess we all have the common decency to do neither, as Mark Twain put it. You know, these myths held US society together for a long time. And the left came along and deconstructed those myths, and that's a good thing. The problem is they didn't replace them with anything. Instead of replacing them with Marxism, they replaced them with there is no truth, right? Statues were toppled all throughout this country. Confederate statues, good. The Confederacy was an abomination, but they weren't replaced with statues of great revolutionary leaders like Nat Turner and Huey Newton and you know, John Brown. They were just kind of torn down. And it's the idea is there is no truth, that statues, any statue is wrong. And that postmodernism and the deconstruction as the only virtue narrative has come to replace this confusion. So many people on the American right, many Americans want to believe in something. Look, I've often used the analogy that if you're driving down the road, imagine you're driving down the road, right? You know, when you're driving down the road, you know where you're going, you know where you came from, you know how fast you need to go to get there, you know what turns you're going to make. So you drive down the road. But imagine you're driving down the road, and suddenly you forget where you're going. You forget where you came from. You forget how you're going to get where you're going. You're going to stop the car. You're just going to be completely and utterly confused. Well, what happened is that, you know, the American ideology, Americanism, American patriotism, blah, 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 it gave people this narrative through which they could get through life. That's what ideology does. It gives you a narrative through which you can identify yourself. It gives you the ability to point to the map and say, this is where I am, this is where I came from, this is where I'm going. If you take ideology away from people, people just become stuck. They just stop, right? Well, Marxism is not about taking ideology away from people. It's saying that the ideology they have is wrong. And it's giving them a new answer of where they came from, a new answer of where they're going, and a new way to get there. And the problem is that instead of postmodernism and what now calls itself the left, this it doesn't give people that. It simply deconstructs the ideology that was already there. And that is what these right-wing grifters are very good at pointing out. They're very good at attacking that. And they're saying, look, you need something to believe in. You need a sense of community. You need a truth. And if you take that away from people, they are going to be at a loss. And I think that that's the issue. And so with the Trump movement, with Jordan Peterson, with these right-wing grifters, they're trying to restore that ideology that the left has deconstructed. That's what Donald Trump was all about, make America great again. And in the face of synthetic leftism and postmodernism, that's a very effective message. But if Marxism could really give people a narrative and give people an ideology and give them something to believe in, I think Marxism could be quite successful. And so that is what they are tapping into. I hope that that answers your question.
Okay, do we have any other questions?
Question on Kamala Harris. She has repainted herself as one of the most liberal senators. Is this a good sign that she'll do better than her past?
Well, I think it shows that Kamala Harris will do what she needs to do in order to present an image of herself. When she was a prosecutor in California, she was all about locking people up. She was all about the death penalty. But now there's been an uprising from below, the Black Lives Matter uprising, and now there's been wide talk of mass incarceration and how bad it is. So she's worked very hard to reinvent her image. But at the end of the day, Kamala Harris is very much controlled by that Hillary Clinton State Department faction and by American intelligence. And they give her a script and she reads it. And she's trying to present herself as kind of the culmination of Black liberation right now and the culmination of freedom and struggles for justice. But her record doesn't match that. And I think that under her leadership, we are going to see more color revolutions, more instability, not just around the world, but also in this country.
All right, so Yusuf has his hand raised. If you want to go ahead and unmute.
Yes, thank you. And also, I remember in the 60s, the image of the working class by the American left was the Archie Bunker character in All in the Family, a very conservative, very anti-left person. And that image, that attitude is still continuing among some factions. Like at an anti-war rally, the head of the the Connecticut AFL-CIO spoke, on our behalf, and she and one of the one person jeered him as a Johnny come lately. I was very disturbed at that. So I thank you for your talk. I think it's right on point.
Sure. Well, this is one aspect of the 1960s New Left that is very, very problematic. Is there is a notion that the American working class are the enemy. And you can see this with the Weather Underground, the way they referred to American workers as pigs. And they said that they benefit from imperialism. You can see this continued with the third worldist trend. There's this book, Settlers, The Mythology of the White Proletariat, that's very popular in left circles, especially among younger people, that presents the idea that American workers, they benefit from imperialism, which is true. They do benefit from imperialism. But on that basis, they are not revolutionary. They're not really part of the working class. Ward Churchill's writings in particular kind of hit on this point. And what's interesting is that while the 1960s New Left was kind of angry at the US working class for not being revolutionary, for being chauvinistic and racist, I think that there is also the neoliberal wing of American capitalism that sees the American working class as an impediment to their goals, right? And that they brought in neoliberalism and free trade, and they were trying to very much demolish that labor aristocracy, that layer of well-paid industrial workers that kind of held the U.S. society together during the Cold War. And so there was kind of a similarity, and they both kind of agreed that average Americans, are the enemy. There was a TV show during the presidency of Richard Nixon called All in the Family, and you mentioned Archie Bunker. Archie Bunker is a working class guy who's seen as a dumb right-wing conservative, and he's, there was a feeling in the New Left that average working class Americans are the enemy, and that point of that feeling really is the introduction of the anti-populism that you can kind of see having overtaken left-wing circles in our time, and that's not what William Z. Foster was about. There was an understanding among the Communist Party that the way to win freedom, for all workers was through black and white united fight, and it's through putting the needs of the oppressed first that all workers can benefit. And the liberation of the black community, the liberation of the Chicano community comes through building class struggle and putting their needs first, but mobilizing the entire working class to fight against the bosses. And settlers and what you can call third worldism and other trends, they erode that, and that is the beginning of the kind of politics that we now see culminating in Kamala Harris.
So Justin's got his hand raised again. Go ahead.
I was gonna ask, within context of everything that's happened so far with the Capitol Capitol riots, and with Kamala's history of being one of the most prolific prosecutors within American history, and how she had a really long career of just locking people up for very minuscule things. Do you think that within the current material conditions that the US faces right now, and with your acknowledgement earlier that there's going to be more violent confrontations that are going to be manifesting outside the US and within the US, what do you think might happen in regards to the United States police state? Do you think that we're facing another Patriot Act 3.0 or something even more dire? I was wondering if you think that Kamala Harris's own pro police, pro law culture that she's built her career up off of might have a hand in that also. I guess it's a bit of a loaded question.
Well, it's quite interesting actually, because Joe Biden has proposed this new domestic terrorism law that would be passed in the aftermath of what happened on Capitol Hill. And if you look at that law, it doesn't really outlaw anything new. It is already illegal to go into the U.S. Capitol and break things. It is already illegal to go into Nancy Pelosi's office and vandalize things and take her property and such. It's already illegal. And this new law proposed by Biden, all it really does is increase the penalties. It's similar to the hate crimes laws, right? That, it's already illegal to murder somebody, but if you can prove that somebody murdered somebody out on the basis of racial hatred, there's a much harsher penalty. This new law proposed by Biden, it argues that if somebody commits an act like vandalism or property destruction or harming a police officer, and you can prove they're ideologically motivated, that this was an act of domestic terrorism, you can give them a much harsher sentence. And I think anyone who is a left-wing activist should be deeply worried about that law, right? I mean, think about it, right? So it's like a protester gets arrested for breaking a window at a demonstration, allegedly, or whatnot. And then the prosecutor says, well, he's an anarchist or he's a socialist and he's motivated by his ideology. So this wasn't just vandalism. This was an act of domestic terrorism. That's very, very frightening. And that's the law that they are proposing. And it's interesting because Kamala Harris was a prosecutor for many years and she knows how the game is played, right? That if it's all about getting people to plea bargain. So if someone's on trial for breaking a window and the sentence is this, they might not plea bargain. But if they're on trial for domestic terrorism and the sentence is 70 years in prison, they might plea bargain much lower. And it's basically enhancing the power of the prosecutor to prosecute people who are arrested at demonstrations. And I think that's an attack on civil liberties. Now, obviously, the country is very shaken by the horrendous events happened at the Capitol, and no one on the left would endorse that kind of activity. You know, I mean, the racist slogans that were chanted, the Confederate flag, no one's supporting what the Trump supporters did. But at the same time, this new law proposed by Biden really has huge implications for anyone who's a left-wing activist.
Okay, do we have any other questions? I see Pella. Go ahead.
How do we get these libertarians and these conservatives to stop conflating neoliberalism with communism?
Well, that's interesting, because I feel like nowadays, right, it's almost like the left and the right are two faces of what the ruling class wants, right? So on the right, you have free markets and neoliberalism. That's what the right is all about. They are all about privatizations, cutbacks, you know, the free market is best, privatize things, get the government off our backs, you know, and that's why all across the country, we have a situation where roads are unpaved. They're actually unpaving the roads in multiple states right now. They have a device called a reclaimer where they pull up the asphalt and pulverize it. And where you used to have a paved road, you have a dirt road. I mean, that's neoliberalism in action. That is free market privatizations, right? Reducing the role of the state in the economy. And neoliberal economics is what the right is pushing for. And it seems like, you know, the pseudo left is about breaking down any sense of community and breaking down any sense of solidarity, telling people there is no truth, there is no need to have loyalty to any group, right? And so it's like, if you have the cultural side of neoliberalism that's being waged by the pseudo left, and you have the economic side of neoliberalism that's being waged by the right wing. But at the end of the day, socialism is about economics, and that, you know, I mean, look, all economic discourse in the United States, from Bernie Sanders to the right wing, is predicated on the lie of the 20th century, that socialism never worked anywhere. Socialism never worked anywhere. It never had any successes. It's failed everywhere it's ever been tried. That's not true. I mean, China has become the second largest economy in the world with socialism. Vietnam has had an economic miracle with socialism. Socialism made the Soviet Union a world industrial superpower. Cuba is respected and loved all over the world for its healthcare system and the high living standard compared to other countries in that region that it provides to its population. It's created the best medical school in the world. Socialism has had many great successes, and socialism, a system where the means of production, the banks, factories, and industries, are organized to serve public good and not for profits. Socialism, a system where you have a government of action that fights for working families. That system has been very successful, and that I think both the mainstream left and the right wing buy into the idea that that is simply not an option. They can't imagine a system beyond capitalism. How often have we heard that the rich are job creators? Well, I'm sorry, in countries where they've overthrown the rich, in countries like Cuba, where the state controls the means of production, people still have jobs. You don't need capitalists to have jobs. That's a myth. But all economic debate in the United States seems to be premised on this mythology that you can't get beyond capitalism, that the attempts to get beyond capitalism, even today or during the 20th century, have all been a failure. And that is what needs to be eroded. And until we can erode that mythology, that mythology of what happened in the 20th century, that mythology of basic economic data, until we can get beyond that, I don't think we can really start to have the discussion. And that's why, you know, I am critical of the Soviet Union. I admit human rights were violated in the Soviet Union. I'm not going to sit here and defend gulags and tell you that nobody who was innocent got persecuted under Stalin. I'm not going to tell you that everything was right about the Cultural Revolution. But the reason that it's necessary to be a quote unquote tanky is because we have to stick up for basic economic facts. Capitalism is not the only way. And the socialist bloc that has existed, despite its problems, has proved that there is a real, genuine alternative to capitalism. And until we get over that big lie that economic discourse is based on, we really can't counter neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is premised on that lie, and we have to combat it. And that requires talking about what actually happened in the history of Marxism and socialism. I'm going to kill the video for just a second, but I'll be on audio, but I'll be right back. I'll be available on audio. I'm just killing the image. I'm here. Just
Okay, so I actually have a question myself. I've been seeing a lot of pieces online about how the next quote unquote authoritarian is going to be more competent than Trump. And do you think that now, with the Democrats in control of both the executive and legislature, that as they fail to deliver for working families, do you think that will drive the general population more towards the left or the right?
I think that if you look at authoritarianism, the root of it in any society is economic, right? When people can't pay their bills, when people are struggling to get by, they tend to want a strong state that will be able to resolve the economic problems. And that is the root of authoritarianism. Franklin Roosevelt said that hungry stomachs are what dictatorships are made by. And this is the truth. And I've pointed out to many people, the reason that the socialist countries of the world have been very authoritarian is because they've developed on a low level economically. They started building socialism in a state of extreme poverty and then under attack by the imperialists. So they were forced to tighten up and build societies that were rather rigid in order to survive in the face of such attacks and start on the road to industrialization and development under those conditions. And the same can be said for capitalism. In an economic crisis, the capitalists fight among each other. When the rate of profits are dropping, when there is a crisis of overproduction, that gives rise to Bonapartism and one section of the ruling class trying to assert its will over other sections, one section of the ruling class trying to assert its will over other sections of the ruling class in order to liquidate the crisis. Every capitalist wants the economy to get better, but every capitalist wants the other capitalists to be the ones to pay for it. They don't want to pay for it. They want the other capitalists to have to pay for it. And during the Great Depression, there was a big struggle in this country between the industrial capitalists and the factory owners like Henry Morgan and Henry Ford, who wanted fascism, and the Rockefellers and the oil bankers that were more open to having a liberal democratic society and were not opposed necessarily. I mean, they were open to the idea of having unionized factories. And there was an attempted coup against Roosevelt by the factory owners, and Henry Morgan and Henry Ford and others were sympathetic to overthrowing Roosevelt and installing a government that would be sympathetic to the factory owners. And these kind of fights happen. And there are divisions right now in the US ruling class. The capitalists are fighting among each other because their system is failing and the rate of profits is dropping. And really what we're dealing with, the root of the authoritarian or illiberal drive in many Western countries right now, the real economic root of it is a massive crisis of overproduction. The computer revolution has basically created a situation where the need for workers on the assembly line is far lower than ever before. I mean, there's a huge shift in how the means of production operate. And millions of people have no place at the assembly line. And as we've learned from Marx, workers are also consumers. And if you eliminate workers from the means of production, and if you drive their wages down and you make them easily replaceable, eventually you can't sell your products and you have a big crisis of overproduction. And we've created this massive global apparatus of production, churning out iPhones and iPads, and we got 3D printers, and they don't have book binderies anymore. They've got, you push a button and a book comes out. They've got machines that make entire books by pushing a button. They've eliminated workers from the means of production. And as a result, millions of workers are left outcast and starving. And as a result of that, they cannot buy the products that the capitalists are producing so efficiently. And so you have a prolonged crisis of overproduction spawned by the computer revolution. And that is what is behind this authoritarian drive. All sections of the capitalist class, they want something to be done to fix this. They want the government to step in and resolve this, but they want it to resolve it at the expense of other factions. They don't want to be the ones to pay for it. And that's the division. And Trump represented one faction of the US ruling class, Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education, who's a billionaire. There was the Bernie Marcus, the owner of Home Depot. There are many wealthy capitalists who were supporting Donald Trump, but there were probably a majority of the capitalist class that didn't, right? And especially Silicon Valley and the super major oil companies, and there were many in the capitalist class who saw Donald Trump as a threat to them and saw him as somebody using the state apparatus not for their benefit, but for the benefit of the other capitalists, like the fracking companies, the weapons manufacturers. So this is the struggle that's been going on. And this is what's behind this crisis that we're in, as the capitalists are desperately trying to save their system. And what's interesting is that in our period, workers are actively being recruited. Usually, when times are good, the capitalists try to work very hard to lock workers out of politics, to keep us from thinking about politics, get us to just kind of focus on sports or celebrity gossip or whatever. But now we're in a period where the capitalists are fighting among each other and recruiting workers to be their foot soldiers and building movements, and funding movements, right, of the left and the right, trying to get workers to act as their foot soldiers to help settle the scores among the capitalists. And that creates an opening for the actual working class to get into motion and put forward its own demands and its own vision. And I mean, if you read What Is to Be Done by Vladimir Lenin, you read the writings of various Marxists, it's when the capitalists are fighting among each other, when workers are brought into motion, it's then that genuine Marxists and revolutionaries can begin to operate and push things in a whole new direction.
All right. Oh, go ahead, Alvin.
Even if we agree with everything you're saying, I'm still concerned that you're not giving us a 1, 2, 3 step out of this crisis.
Well, ultimately, what needs to be done is massive education. At the end of the day, that is what needs to be done, because the concepts of Marx and Lenin and capitalism as the problem and class struggle have been so widely eroded that until there is a change in consciousness, there's not really going to be a way forward. And probably the greatest error I observe in the organized left at this time is tailism, right? Is just kind of going along with whatever the left is doing, whatever the liberals are doing. We just kind of repeat it louder, and try to emphasize that being a communist means that you're in line with what these liberals want. And that's what Lenin called bowing to spontaneity. And that, what we want is fundamentally different than what Kamala Harris wants and what George Soros wants and what the voices representing the synthetic left want. But there is a huge audience now that is open to hearing what we stand for. And that, I mean, the fact that I made this video recently addressing Trump supporters, and many Trump supporters watched it, and many people said they sent it to all their relatives who are Trump supporters, and they watched it and had never heard a communist talk that way. And that there are many people all throughout this country who are suffering, who want a solution, who are open to hearing about the problems with capitalism. And rather than engaging in tailism and bowing to spontaneity and movementism, the duty of those of us who really understand that capitalism is the root of the crisis is to get to the broad masses of people with our unique understanding, and get to them with the real history of the 20th century, and get to them with a real revolutionary working class program that involves, changing property relations and building a society where the people come first and profits are not in command. And I think that is the 1, 2, 3 step. We have to get to the broad masses of people with a revolutionary program. And we have to get, I've often used the phrase, out of the movement and to the masses. Because the movement, I mean, there's nothing wrong with going to protests and going to demonstrations, but at the end of the day, the minority of Americans, the very, very small percentage of Americans that are involved in left-wing and protests and demonstrations, are not the ones who are going to make a revolution in the United States. Socialism will be brought by the broad masses of Americans, many of whom have never met a socialist or a communist and have no idea what we're about. And we need to get to them. And then now is the time for broad educational work. And now is the time to face to the masses, not the time to try and take over the movement. That has been my position for a long time.
Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left. Does anyone have any other questions?
What about a link to the movie you just created? How do we get there?
Oh, it's on my YouTube channel. You can check it out. I made a message to Trump supporters. It's on my YouTube channel. You can just type Caleb Maupin into YouTube. It should come up. I tried to reach out to Trump supporters and get them to understand capitalism is the problem, talk to them about police brutality and what's going on, and that educational work is needed now more than ever. I've been working with other people to develop a think tank called the Center for Political Innovation that would go around the country, having educational events, publishing books, and trying to raise awareness about this crisis. And we republished Gaddafi's Green Book, the Green Book of Gaddafi. We published, the first book we published was my book on Kamala Harris. We have many more works, many more in the works. We're going to publish a new edition of Socialism, Utopian and Scientific by Frederick Engels that will be specifically have an introduction specifically aimed at addressing this issue. And it'll be about getting to the broad masses of people and getting to average Americans with a socialist message. And that is what is needed now more than ever, because there are a lot of voices misrepresenting socialism out there and leading the working class in the wrong direction. And there's a lot of workers who have been hoodwinked by the demagogy of Donald Trump or the demagogy of other right-wingers who tell them that Marxism is the source of their problems. And that is not the case. Marxism is not the source of their problems.
Caleb. Hello?
Go ahead.
Caleb, I want to say I think you're doing a great job. Your video that you just made, several of my friends, they're white and they're pretty normal in their attitudes. And they told me this is the first thing I can actually share with my family, my blue collar family. And I've been hearing a lot of that. I've been seeing a lot of that online. People don't want to be told that they're, pieces of crap. They're no good because of how they were born. And I think that you're talking to a lot of people who you can actually build bridges with. I think you're taking the exact right strategy. And, the Bolsheviks from the 30s were saying, they were writing things in the 20s and 30s that were saying the same exact thing as what you're saying, which is when these declassed middle class, when these military that came back from war, they were looking for answers. And a lot of radicals were telling them, you can just go to hell. And that was an error. That was an error that the Bolsheviks reflected on and wrote extensively on. And that I think that today the left is going to look back on it and say, wow, we messed up, when they see 10, 20 years from now, the fascist movement grow. So I think that you're doing the exact right thing. And I want to say that I want to applaud that part. I think you're doing a great job.
Well, thank you. And I mean, there is a bit of a historical precedent of this. One great example, you referenced the Bolsheviks, was that in Russia, in the pre-revolutionary period, there was a fascist movement that emerged. It was called the Black Hundreds Party. And it was an anti-Semitic Tsarist movement it was an attempt to build a mass movement to defeat the revolutionaries, right? And they called the Black Hundreds. They wore hoods a lot like the Ku Klux Klan here, except they were black. They went around committing hate crimes against Jewish people. There was the publication of the anti-Semitic screed, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, etc. And when this Black Hundreds Party was being formed, Lenin told the Bolsheviks to go to the Black Hundreds Party's meetings and recruit the Black Hundreds and win them to Marxism, right? He didn't tell the workers, oh, any worker who's part of the Black Hundreds, just spit on them and attack them. He said, no, go to their meetings, argue with them, and win them to Marxism. And the Bolsheviks were actually very successful. There were many workers who went from the Black Hundreds Party to the Bolsheviks, and that you wouldn't know that, right? That has been obscured, but you can read about it, where Lenin says, look, a lot of these workers are just confused. They've been told by the Tsarist autocracy to be anti-Semitic or to be hateful, but workers are joining this mass movement out of confusion. And so it's the duty of the revolutionaries to win them to the truth and to genuine politics, and that happened. And it's also worth noting that that during the 1930s in Germany, there were many people in the German Communist Party who had been recruited out of the Nazi Party, and they saw the lies of the Nazis and came over to the Communist Party. Now, obviously, there weren't enough of them to be victorious, and there were many factors that contributed to the ultimate victory of fascism. But it was understood largely that the Nazi Party and the Communist Party recruited from the same neighborhoods. The poor and desperate people that were unemployed. Some of them would become fascists, and some of them would become communists. And this idea that anybody, anyone associated with the far right, they're permanently evil and should be canceled, I think is not correct. And that we are trying to get to people who are unhappy with capitalism and win them to an anti-racist, anti-imperialist revolutionary program. That is what we were trying to do. And the goal is not to kind of wage a culture war that ultimately benefits one wing of the ruling class at the expense of the other. That is what separates us from a lot of the liberals. I think a lot of the liberals are waging a culture war. Look, there's a big gap between the coastal areas and middle America. The Midwest and the South are culturally quite different than New York City and Boston and San Francisco and Los Angeles and Chicago, right? That there are some big cultural difference. There's a big cultural gap in the United States. There's millions of Americans who could never understand why anyone would vote for Donald Trump. There's millions of Americans who couldn't understand why anybody wouldn't vote for Donald Trump. there's a cultural gap. But at the end of the day, Marxists, we're the ones fighting for the entire class and trying to win them free from all demagogy and win them to our revolutionary program. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx interestingly writes, he says, communists support every uprising against the existing order of things, but in all of those uprisings, they bring forth the question of property relations. One of my biggest regrets is, when the Tea Party was happening. You remember that when the Tea Party was happening against Barack Obama, right? This was an awful right-wing movement, mobilizing people against Obama, taxed enough already or whatever. My regret is that as leftists, we didn't find a way to talk to the Tea Party and say, well, the reason your taxes are high is because the tax code is rigged by the 1% and the rich. And that, Barack Obama is not a communist. He's a representative of American imperialism and empire, and that free markets are not going to free the country. The answer is socialist revolution. And, if we had found a way, now it may have been very difficult. It may have been a risk physically, right? Who knows? You could have gone to talk to them and they could have been violent with you. So obviously you'd have to figure out how to do it in a safe way and in a principled way where you didn't look like you were supporting their demagogy or their racism. But there should have been an effort to win people who are in motion to genuine, correct revolutionary politics, and that the left needs to get into a situation where we're reaching out to the broad masses of people. Bernie Sanders, as much as he's not a communist or a revolutionary, one thing that I think Bernie Sanders says that kind of shows he's kind of smart is that he says that the Democrats need a 50-state strategy. And that's certainly in confrontation with what Kamala Harris and the DNC want. They don't want a 50-state strategy. They want the blue states to rule over the red states. And the Republicans want the red states to rule over the blue states. Well, Bernie Sanders, because he's a bit of a social democrat, he understands that the Democrats really want to have a long-term hold on power. They need a 50-state strategy. And Andrew Yang, who's emerging, he's now running for mayor of New York City, he has made similar statements that the key to power is not picking one section of the population and inciting them against another section. It's getting to all of the people with a program that can advance the whole country. So I think that's something Marxists can learn from.
All right, Deborah had her
Wadia.
hand raised first, so
Wadia, I wanted to raise something.
go ahead, Wadia.
Yes, so first, really, Caleb, to thank you for this presentation and all the great insights. I'm one of the volunteers at the Center for Marxist Education. And absolutely, the point against Stalinism is of great importance. And obviously the question of education and Marxism, that's critical. And I certainly have hopes to turn the Center for Marxist Education into a worldwide franchise like McDonald's, but with a different perspective. And as a result, that I can retire young and comfortable. But in addition to the task of education is the question of organizing. And organizing on a global scale. Workers of the world unite to lead the humanity's transition from capitalism to socialism. And wanted to point out, even though the Soviet Union's fallen, the global movement created by the Russian Revolution, the communist parties of the world, who maintain relationship between them. These parties have 106 million members, and of immense importance. There are over 415 million workers in the labor unions affiliated with the world movement created by the Russian Revolution. So a huge part of the task is essentially organizing, the conscious organizing of the world movement and of the unions. Like a British coal miner once said to me before the union was destroyed, if we just learn to spit together, we can drown the bastards. And it's a matter of effectively developing that organization and consciousness. But to point out, there is such a world movement, and in the face of the crisis of world capitalism, which has just brought deepening poverty, year after year after year, about a 1% per year decline before the crisis of 2008 across the capitalist world, compared to essentially elimination of extreme poverty in the states formed by socialist revolutions. There are just 5 remaining now, down from 17 in the 1980s. But if effectively, essentially, like Marx said, the whip of reaction urges the revolution on, and there is a critical movement whose point of reference is the Russian Revolution, reinforced by every subsequent revolution, including the Chinese, and where an enormous amount has been learned in terms of studying society and mobilizing not only the workers but the mass of the poor. In any case, a friend did send me that important video you just prepared to Trump supporters, and the question I have is, something smells about what happened January 6th, just as with September 11th, 2001. In other words, at the minimum, something was allowed to happen to then justify, and wanted your read on that. Something doesn't hold together about what happened January 6th.
You're absolutely right. I mean, as someone who's been to many protests in DC over the years, you can't just walk into the Capitol. And many of these people walked in through doors that were open. I mean, doors were just kind of left open, and these people just walked right in. And that indicates that something was allowed to happen. What's also interesting is many of these people were adherents of the QAnon movement. And QAnon, these are people that in the Trump movement that believe there's someone with a Q level security clearance called Q, the anonymous Q, who's giving them secret tips from inside the government. So it's very likely these people were approached by somebody who purported to represent someone inside the government and gave them permission and encouraged them to do this. And that is actually the defense that a number of them have already started to make, that they've been arrested. They've said they're calling it the Trump defense. Donald Trump told us to do this. And that raises some questions. And I mean, they already are a mass movement that thinks the government is giving them secret orders or something. So this raises a lot of questions. And I don't think they would have been able to do what they did if the DC and Capitol Police had not, accommodated them to some degree or other. But the question is, was this done simply by the Trump faction to intimidate their rivals, as is largely believed, or was this done partially by Trump's enemies to create kind of a perfect storm through which to permanently remove and defeat his faction? And that is not clear. And honestly, it could be a little bit of both. I mean, it could be that Donald Trump wanted to rattle Congress and threaten them a little bit, and someone caught on to this and made it something that he completely lost control of. And I mean, we will just have to see. I suspect in the future there will be entire books written by investigative journalists about what exactly happened. But the narrative that we're largely getting from the mainstream, that this was an attempted coup, doesn't seem exactly right, because a coup would have a chance of succeeding. And these folks, there was no one in the military marching in to back them up. And I don't buy that it was an attempted coup per se. It was definitely an illegal action. It was definitely an act of intimidation. It was definitely done by people who had very, very bad intentions. But wasn't an attempted coup? I don't think so.
All right, Deborah's been patiently waiting for a while, and then we'll get to Richard. So why don't you go ahead, Deborah? You'll need to unmute your microphone.
Deborah, your
say
mic
it
is still
again.
muted.
Deborah, unmute yourself and uh, that'll open things up on the lower left of the screen.
There, is that better?
There
Now
you
can
go.
hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I guess because I try to stay optimistic, but I'm really nervous about a Harris presidency. Is that really the best we can do, is just educate people? It just seems so hopeless.
Well, I don't think the situation is hopeless, because I think that people are ready to hear about this. And the fact that we saw this huge explosion around Black Lives Matter indicates that the people of this country, many of them are sick and tired of the police state. Many are ready to fight back and resist. And the resistance of the masses will continue. The question is, the reason education is important is because they don't have the ideology with which to turn that spontaneous uprising into something that could actually save the country from capitalism. And that's the role that those of us who are ideologically trained and understand Marxism can play. But ultimately, I don't, as much as Kamala Harris might want to turn this country into a low-wage prison as rapidly as she can, I don't think the broad masses of people are going to take that. I mean, if you look at what happened over the summer, I don't think they're going to accept that. And if you look at how scared the politicians really were of the broad masses of people during the uprising, and how, you know, they very much just kind of stood down and stood back, and yeah, I think there's really big potential here for the broad masses of people to be in motion. But it's with Marxism that motion will be guided in the direction that it needs to go.
All right, we've got Richard, then Yusuf, and then we need to get wrapping up. So go ahead, Richard.
Okay, thank you. I'm Richard. I'm calling from California. I'm very happy to be included in this discussion. I very much appreciate the excellent presentation. A couple of minor points I want to, well, one minor. My feeling when Kamala Harris was first elected to Attorney General of California in 2011, she suddenly started appearing on national TV quite a bit. And I think her grooming actually preceded by about 5 years the time you suggest. But that's a minor point. The other point I'd like to bring up was the question of the socialist countries. There is a strong tendency within the Marxist-Leninist left, the genuine Marxist-Leninist left, to dismiss China as a socialist country. And secondly, there is a tendency to insist that Russia is a imperialist country. And the last thing is, it's almost universal that among the genuine Marxist left, there's a dismissal of the role of Russia. It's one of the only achievements that I think Trump had, was to urge normalization of relations with Russia, and that infuriated the imperialists. I think that's probably the main thing that caused them to want to get rid of Trump right from the beginning. And of course, Putin himself is very popular in the United States, especially among sort of conservative-oriented people. And you know, Putin says he never stopped being a communist. He says that publicly. He never quit the Communist Party. The Communist Party quit him. And so, you know, just a couple of points there. But again, thank you very much for your presentation.
Sure. I will just say, I mean, I've been to Russia many times, and I've been in the same room as Vladimir Putin on a number of times. And it's been made clear to me that Vladimir Putin does not believe in Marxism. Marxism is not his worldview. However, you know, the reason that Vladimir Putin is so loved is because he stopped neoliberalism. After the fall of the Soviet Union, neoliberal economics was imposed on Russia. You know, free market reforms, Boris Yeltsin and others, they brought in free market deregulation, and they looted the place. And Putin's rise to power was on a program of nationalizing the oil and gas, creating two state-run energy firms that were then used to reboot the economy. and kind of reasserting state control over the economy and saving Russia economically from the disaster of the fall of the Soviet Union. So in that way, Putin's economic program is very much a left-wing program of utilizing the state to protect people from the greed of capitalists, et cetera. But Putin is very much a cultural conservative, I think, and that I mean, they very much, he sees his leadership as as kind of continuing a long tradition of Russia as a civilization. And China, I think, is very much a socialist country, and China is building socialism. But China's socialism has certainly adjusted and adapted. And one of the strengths of Chinese socialism has been its ability to adapt and evolve over time, and try out a policy in one city and then apply it on a national level after they've experimented with it, et cetera. And President Xi Jinping is very much moving China in a more socialistic direction, kind of rolling back some of the liberalization that took place and waging a campaign against corruption. So, both Russia and China are very, very important. They are really centers of anti-imperialism, and that imperialism is an economic relationship. Imperialism is when countries go around the world beating down other countries and keeping them as captive markets, stopping development. So, I say imperialism is keeping the world poor so that Wall Street and London can stay rich. And the governments that the imperialists target tend to be governments that are independent and raising people out of poverty. Often they're socialist governments, not always. And that if you look at the role Russia and China are playing around the world, it's not an imperialist role. They are doing the opposite. They go to countries and help them to develop. They build industries, they build infrastructure, they help the domestic economy of countries to prosper, and they try to build up the economic independence of countries. So if you understand the economics of imperialism, Russia and China are simply not imperialists. But do Russia and China have a lot of influence around the world? Sure. Are there Russian and Chinese corporations that make a lot of profits around the world? Sure. But if you understand imperialism the way Lenin understood it as an economic relationship, it should be very clear to people on the left that Russia and China are not imperialist countries. And I think that's an important point that should be raised.
Yusuf, you can go ahead, and then we're going to wrap up.
Okay. Thank you very much. Also, could you also make some comments that when fascism actually seizes state power, one of the first things they do is get rid of their working class base. Hitler, one of the quite early in the game, but I shocked a comrade by just making the statement when Hitler cracked down on the stormtroopers, and he said, "What? Yes, exactly. It's called the Night of the Long Knives, where 1,000 of the SA and one of Hitler's closest associates, Röhm, were killed, murdered by the SS." And that was because why the big corporations, Krupp and so on, said, "Well, get rid of your working class base." So could you make some comments on that, please?
Sure. That fascism, before it's in power, foments a lot of street fighting and terrorism and chaos and violence. And when fascists take power, they generally want the chaos and violence and street fighting to end. And the Night of the Long Knives, as you referenced, that was the transition. And that I almost, tell people it's kind of the difference between the Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Council. The Ku Klux Klan was a street fighting, violent organization that went around lynching and murdering people. And the White Citizens Council was a group of, politicians who wear suits and were lobbying for racist policies. And that the Night of the Long Knives was when the Nazi Party transitioned from being the Ku Klux Klan to being the White Citizens Council. And, the chaos in the streets, the violence was over, and now they were going to create an authoritarian fascist state to carry out their program. And Ernst Röhm and Gregor Strasser and others who were leaders of the Nazi street fighting ultimately were executed, so the Nazis could transition into being a fascist authoritarian police state party, not a street fighting chaos party. And it also shows that fascists often will say things that they don't mean. The Nazis did offer at one point an economic left-wing program, but as they moved toward taking power, they suddenly said, well, National Socialism just means that every capitalist has to be patriotic and loyal to the nation, and the socialism of National Socialism was completely meaningless. But they said a lot of things they didn't mean on the road to taking power. And I think you can compare that to how Donald Trump said he was going to cancel student debt, and he was going to restore Glass-Steagall, and he said he was going to build infrastructure. And Donald Trump made a lot of progressive economic, promises on the campaign trail. But then in office, he presided over neoliberalism. One thing I will say is that in a way, it's almost like the inverse of Trotskyism and what happened in the Soviet Union, because, it seems like basically the division in our ruling class is between advocates of global neoliberal revolution, like Kamala Harris, and neoliberalism in one country, which is the Trump program. And it seems like as the capitalists are trying to create, this global low wage police state economy, there's some who are thinking in global terms about spreading it around the world, and some who are focused on imposing it here at home. And that's really the division between Trump and his rivals. And so I expect now with Kamala Harris, and Joe Biden taking office, we're going to see more of an emphasis on the global goals of U.S. corporations, rather than simply the deregulation and privatization on the short-term goals of U.S.-based companies. So I think that's probably the division.
All right, I want to thank you, Caleb, for giving this talk. It was a really excellent one. And I just want to let everyone know that the center still needs to pay its bills. So if you are able to, please donate through our website, centerformarxisteducation.org. And just a word about our upcoming event next Saturday at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard on wage theft in Massachusetts. We hope to see you there. And I want to thank everyone for attending, and have a great day.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.